Hello and welcome to Reading the Victorian Novel, A Tale of Two Cities. Today we continue our discussion of Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, the fifth monthly installment, Book 2, chapters 19 through 24. So as a reminder, what happens in these chapters? In 19, an opinion, Pross and Laurie chop up Manette's shoemaking paraphernalia. In chapter 20, a plea, Sidney asks to be Darnay's friend and come no more than half a dozen times a year to their house uninvited. Chapter 21, echoing footsteps, we have baby Lucie born, we have a dead son, and we storm the Bastille. It's a very interesting combination of events in one. Then in chapter 22, the sea rises, we have the Defarges and the hanging of Foulon. Chapter 22, fire rises, the burning of the chateau. And then finally, in chapter 24, drawn to the lodestone rock, a reference to the Arabian Nights, we have Gabelle's letter, who is the former caretaker of the chateau, and then Darnay and Laurie independently travel to France. It's kind of a timeline check-in. Here's how we've moved. In book 1, chapter 1, we started in 1775, book 2, chapter 1, 1780, book 2, chapter 10, 1781, and then we jump quite a bit for today's readings, book 2, chapter 21, 1789, and then book 2, chapter 24, 3 years later, 1792. So we are covering rather a vast span of time. All right. We're going to start in chapter 2, 19. Book 2, chapter 19. And my focus on the next few slides is going to be on Dickens's interest in psychology. So Dickens was incredibly interested in a practice called mesmerism and kind of spiritualism in general, this idea of how the human mind works. At the same time that Dickens is kind of writing, and a little bit after, advances are being made, really serious advances by Freud over in Germany. And in fact, Freud's favorite novel was David Copperfield, if you're ever looking for a fun fact, even though, yes, he is a fair amount after this. But generally, there are advances happening. This is Laurie speaking. My dear Manette, it is the case of an old and prolonged shock, of great acuteness and severity to the affections, the feelings, as you express it, the mind. The mind, it is the case of a shock under which the sufferer was borne away, down. One cannot say for how long, because I believe he cannot calculate the time himself, and there are no other means of getting at it. It is the case of a shock from which the sufferer recovered by a process that he cannot trace himself, as I once heard him publicly relate in a striking manner. So the repetition of the word shock, we have it 3 times, here, here, and here, surrounding this, what is called anadiplosis, where you end a sentence with a phrase or a word, and then you begin the next one with that same one. It's a form of emphasis. And what we have here is a focus on trauma. How does trauma affect the physical experience of memory and even of the body? And so we have an idea almost of recovery from that these figures are trying to figure out. Furthermore, we have a wonderful moment here where Manette had talked about it in the past. He publicly related it. And we have the idea of maybe the public lectures in psychology. We have now therapeutic methods, specifically kind of the talking method or therapy. This is still Laurie. You have no idea how such an apprehension weighs on the sufferer's mind, and how difficult, almost impossible it is for him to force himself to utter a word on the topic that oppresses him. So that was Manette. Would he, asked Mr. Laurie, be sensibly relieved if he could prevail upon himself to impart that secret brooding to anyone when it is on him? Manette, I think so, but it is, as I have told you, next to impossible. I even believe it, in some cases, to be quite impossible. And so here we have a debate. How effective is talk therapy? And then finally, I think it helps if we think about Manette and his use of his shoe mending tools as almost a form of addiction when you see some of this language that Dickens uses. But may not mind, I asked for information as a plodding man of business who only deals with such material objects as guineas, shillings, and banknotes. May not the retention of the thing involve the retention of the idea? If the thing were gone, my dear Manette, might not the fear go with it? In short, is it not a concession to the misgiving to keep the forge? And then a little bit earlier, we had Laurie also saying, but unfortunately, there had been a slight relapse. And so this idea of trying to overcome an addiction by, you have to get rid of it in order to no longer have that opportunity and reminder. And so again, all of book 2, chapter 19, really, I think, working through the psychological aspects of trauma and even kind of addictive personalities related to that traumatic experience. Once he's given the green light, we have a very interesting development that comes along where we word it in criminal language. This is Pross and Laurie working together. And we had started talking about the two of them in cahoots in the last installment when they worked together to keep information away from Lucie. And if you'll remember, we talked about how it's a strange alliance. They don't align in gender, and they don't align in class, and they don't align in age, but they do have being single as a unifying force, and they have the Manettes as well that draw them together. On the night of the day on which he left the house, Mr. Laurie went into his room with a chopper, saw, chisel, and hammer, attended by Miss Pross carrying a light. There, with closed doors and in a mysterious and guilty manner, Mr. Laurie hacked the shoemaker's bench to pieces, while Miss Pross held the candle, as if she were assisting at a murder, for which, indeed, in her grimness, she was no unsuitable figure. The burning of the body, previously reduced to pieces convenient for the purpose, was commenced without delay in the kitchen fire, and the tools, shoes, and leather were buried in the garden. So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds, that Mr. Laurie and Miss Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and in the removal of its traces, almost felt, and almost looked, like accomplices in a horrible crime. So one thing that this is doing is it's setting up a pathetic comparison to the storming of the Bastille later, where we will have horrible crime, murder, in order to enter a small space, which Manette formerly inhabited, to recover something from it. And here we have kind of Pross and Laurie committing murder on this body, which is just the bench. So it's interesting, right? On the surface, I do think it's meant for a comic effect, and yet there's also something genuinely horrible happening here where they are taking away Manette's source of comfort. And they don't actually know what the effect long-term on his psychology will be in doing this. All right, this is about Lucie's attempt to be serious and the failure of Darnay to match her in that seriousness. So Sydney has just come and made the request, and then Lucie knows his mind. After they leave, Darnay kind of makes some jokes at Sydney's expense, and then Lucie wants to talk to him. He had no idea that this could dwell in the thoughts of his fair young wife, but when he afterwards joined her in their own rooms, he found her waiting for him with the old pretty lifting of the forehead strongly marked. "We are thoughtful tonight," said Darnay, drawing his arm around her. "Yes, Charles, dearest," with her hands on his breast and the inquiring and attentive expression fixed upon him. "We are rather thoughtful tonight, for we have something on our mind tonight. What is it, my Lucie? Will you promise not to press one question on me, if I beg you not to ask it?" "Will I promise? What will I not promise to my love?" "What indeed?" With his hand putting aside the golden hair from the cheek, and his other hand resting against the heart that beat for him. He bent over the golden head, and put the rosy lips to his, and folded her in his arms. If one forlorn wanderer then pacing the dark streets could have heard her innocent disclosure, and could have seen the drops of pity kissed away by her husband from the soft blue eyes, so loving of that husband, he might have cried to the night, and the words would not have parted his lips for the first time. God bless her, for her sweet compassion. So what I want to point out here, even though I cut out all the parts where she makes this request, is Darnay's like obsessed with having his hands on her, right? He is interested in the erotic aspect of his marriage. Even the narrator is in cahoots with him that way by calling it an old pretty lifting of the forehead. She, meanwhile, is trying to be a serious person, but nobody in this novel, even the narrator, gives her a chance to be serious. And we'll see that again and again. And so she finally gets through. And then immediately, Darnay, kind of distractedly almost, agrees to the promise so that he can put his hands on her again. And then notice in this last paragraph, the language, he bent over the golden head. He put the rosy lips to his. So he draws her face to him. He folds her in his arms. There's no kind of responsiveness coming from her in this moment. It concludes with this hypothetical, if one forlorn wanderer. And so what we're meant to conclude, I think pretty clearly, is that Sidney is outside at this moment, seeing these things happen. He doesn't necessarily see the nuance that we do and the almost resistance that we do. All right, so then in chapter 21, we make our time jumps as we has happened. So, and we open with this passage. And what goes on here in its oblique is Lucie's terror of giving birth and her fear of maternal mortality and also of infant mortality. At first, there were times, though she was a perfectly happy young wife, when her work would slowly fall from her hands and her eyes would be dimmed. For there was something coming in the echoes, something light, afar off, and scarcely audible yet, that stirred her heart too much, fluttering hopes and doubts, hopes of a love as yet unknown to her, doubts of her remaining upon the earth to enjoy that new delight, divided her breast. Among the echoes, then, there would arise the sound of footsteps at her own early grave, and thoughts of the husband who would be left so desolate, and who would mourn for her so much, swelled to her eyes and broke like waves. So here, fluttering hopes, that's the love as yet unknown to her, is the child. And then the doubt of her remaining upon earth is the maternal mortality, dying in childbirth or shortly thereafter. The other thing that's happening here is we're echoing an enormous amount of the language used to describe the French Revolution, which is also an echo and also has kind of a constant liquid oceanic metaphor surrounding it. And so there's something really interesting about like France giving birth to a revolution, Lucie giving birth to baby Lucie. The first child is Lucie, a young girl. Notice this idea of the fluttering hope. I think this is going to be, it's a callback from 9 years earlier in David Copperfield, 1850, to Dora. And what we have happening there is this moment where we have the Dora getting sick after her miscarriage. But as that year wore on, Dora was not strong. I had hoped that lighter hand than mine would help to mold her character, and that a baby smile upon her breast might change my child wife to a woman. It was not to be. The spirit fluttered for a moment on the threshold of its little prison, and unconscious of captivity, took wing. So there, spirit fluttered. Here, she is afraid on that fluttering hope. So I think there's some echoes here of Dora to Lucie, which might have a little bit of potential to think more about Lucie's role in A Tale of Two Cities. Here are just some quick statistics coming from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. On the left, estimates of maternal mortality rates. And you'll see in the dates of our timeline, 1750 to 1800, 7.5 per 1,000 live births are maternal mortality rate, and kind of high. It does go down. And then this was an interesting fact that's included in this article. It is only recently that the Church of England prayer book removed the service for the, quote, churching of women who had recently given birth, end quote, which starts by giving thanks to God for the safe deliverance and preservation from the great dangers of childbirth. So Dickens, as a really loyal attendee of the Anglican Church, would have been very familiar with that prayer. With this passage, we also have infant mortality. And so here is the death of Lucie's little brother. There's a lot of echoes here of young Paul Dombey. I don't bring them in, but they're kind of this overly eloquent young boy that dies and gives a last speech. Also a little bit of Little Nell as well, though Little Nell is quite a bit older than these younger figures. Even when there were sounds of sorrow among the rest, they were not harsh nor cruel. Even when golden hair, like her own, lay in a halo on a pillow round the worn face of a little boy, and he said with a radiant smile, "Dear Papa and Mama, I am very sorry to leave you both and to leave my pretty sister, but I am called and I must go." Those were not tears all of agony that wetted his young mother's cheek as the spirit departed from her embrace that had been entrusted to it. "Suffer them and forbid them not. They see my father's face. Oh, Father, blessed words." And the narrator kind of taking over there. So here is a chart from 2022 populationspass.org. Take it or leave it. At the infant mortality rate, you see right here, we're picking up at 1850, so we can imagine it being even higher. But we're looking at kind of a minimum idea of 160-ish, 150 deaths per 1,000. So a really significant number. The other thing that happens in this chapter, and it is kind of amazing, is we storm the Bastille. So we're making this clear connection between the domestic and Lucie's family in England versus the political in France. And I've already talked about this idea of two different ways of giving birth. We give birth to an individual and we give birth to a revolution. Here on the left is an image of the Bastille coming from Sanders's companion. And if you count the towers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and know that they're mirrored on the back, 5, 6, 7, 8, we will see these show up in Dickens's description. Deep ditches, double drawbridge, massive stone walls, 8 great towers, cannon, muskets, fire, and smoke. Through the fire and through the smoke, in the fire and in the smoke, for the sea cast him up against a cannon, and on an instant he became a cannoneer. Defarge of the wine shop worked like a manful soldier. 2 fierce hours. Deep ditch, single drawbridge, massive stone walls, 8 great towers, cannon, muskets, fire, and smoke. 1 drawbridge down. Right. So I love this detail of the deep ditches then becoming the deep ditch as they make progress forward. All of the repetition, all of the very short movement of the syllables, where we go from 8 great towers, then to disyllabic cannon, disyllabic muskets, then monosyllabic fire and smoke. And then through the fire and through the smoke, in the fire and in the smoke. It's really one of these instances of Dickens's mob scenes where the kind of rhythms change to iambic pentameter to imitate the onward thrust of the crowd. In this moment, we have the death of the governor. And what I want to point out here now, this is all about Madame Defarge, who will be immovable many times until she moves with great alacrity. In the howling universe of passion and contention that seemed to encompass this grim old officer, conspicuous in his gray coat and red decoration, there was but one quiet, steady figure, and that was a woman. "See, there is my husband," she cried, pointing him out. "See, Defarge." She stood immovable close to the grim old officer, and remained immovable close to him, through the streets, as Defarge and the rest bore him along, remained immovable close to him when he was got near his destination and began to be struck at from behind, remained immovable close to him when the long gathering rains of stabs and blows fell heavy, was so close to him when he dropped dead under it, that, suddenly animated, she put her foot upon his neck and with her cruel knife, long ready, hewed off his head. I like kind of the paradox here that her movability actually involves movement because they have this progress, and just the stolidness with which she stands in the midst of this, the sea of bodies that are in constant motion. And then a bit on punctuation right here. Her cruel knife dash, long ready, dash, hewed off its head, these dashes acting as the hewing of the long ready, separating that part. Really, really nice. It's a visual decapitation through punctuation. In chapter 22, we have a kind of interesting philosophy of revolution presented to us. Madame Defarge, with her arms folded, sat in the morning light and heat, contemplating the wine shop and the street. There's a rhyme. In both there were several knots of loungers, squalid and miserable, but now with a manifest sense of power enthroned on their distress. The raggedest nightcap awry on the wretchedest head had this crooked significance in it. I know how hard it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to support life in myself. But do you know how easy it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to destroy life in you? So this is a philosophy of the ruling classes, right? If you're going to keep a population, a significantly larger population, down below you under your boot heels, you need to make it so that they don't realize their power that they have once they reach a snapping point, a breaking point, a point at which they can no longer endure what is insufferable, no longer suffer the evils that are pressed upon them. And so you keep them hungry, desperate, and poor, they're working to eat, but you move them beyond that place and they have to revolt, and then they realize how tenuous the powerful's strength and power is and how easily it can be taken away. So just a philosophy of maintaining a ruling class, I guess, for those of you that want to do that. Maybe a philosophy of revolution for the rest. We get a really exciting simile that comes to us, and I think it points out a number of things. The people immediately behind Madame Defarge explaining the cause of her satisfaction to those behind them, and those again explaining to others, and those to others. The neighboring streets resounded with the clapping of hands. Similarly, during 2 or 3 hours of drawl and the winnowing of many bushels of words, Madame Defarge's frequent expressions of impatience were taken up, with marvelous quickness, at a distance. The more readily, because certain men, who had by some wonderful exercise of agility, climbed up the external architecture to look in from the windows, knew Madame Defarge well, and acted as a telegraph between her and the crowd outside the building. So on one hand, you can argue, oh, this is an anachronism. The telegraph doesn't actually come around until the middle of, or like the 1830s. So 30-ish, 40 years past these events. However, there's a history of the telegraph, and the first form of the telegraph was actually figures like waving flags, almost a semaphore, a speech through flags that was conducted. So that seems to be maybe what's happening here. However, I want to press that maybe it's appropriate to have the technological metaphor because it shows the extreme newness of modernity that is being brought in by the French Revolution. A few other things that this indicates: organization, central communication hubs, right? We're starting in the core and we are communicating outward. A woman is at the middle and men are working for her as the communicants. So if you think in some ways about the Tale of Two Cities being a novel interested in the technology of communication, we start with the mail, the coach itself being a metaphor of how to move information. Jerry Cruncher comes up with an oral communication. And then we have this moment here with signals. We also had them previously with Madame Defarge's silent codes, the rose, and certain lingo that's used. In the drawn to the lodestone rock, we'll have a letter from Gabelle that sends Darnay to France. And then we also have Laurie taking a verbal communication from Darnay to Gabelle. So we have all of these different modes of communication at work. There's a telegraph in David Copperfield. For some reason, David Copperfield's on my mind these days. And here we had, and this is in 1850, Mr. Dick, nor not another word did Mr. Dick utter on the subject, but he made a very telegraph of himself for the next half hour. That was a little bit more topical because in 1850, the first underwater cable was laid between England and France. So telegraphs are in the air. All right, here's the hanging of Foulon. And I know this looks like an incredibly long paragraph. I'm just putting it here so you can see it because I'm going to break it up here into clauses. What I want to discuss at this moment is something I call Dickens's performative punctuation. That is, punctuation is not meant to be grammatical, but it's meant to guide us in either a performance or a movement through the passage. Down and up and head foremost on the steps of the building, semicolon. Now on his knees, semicolon. Now on his feet, semicolon. Now on his back, semicolon. Dragged and struck at and stifled by the bunches of grass and straw that were thrust in his face by hundreds of hands, semicolon. torn, bruised, panting, bleeding, yet always entreating and beseeching for mercy, semicolon. Now full of vehement agony of action, with a small clear space about him as the people drew one another back that they might see. Now a log of dead wood drawn through a forest of legs. He was hauled, semicolon. He was hauled to the nearest street corner where one of the fatal lamps swung, and there Madame Defarge let him go, dash, as a cat might have done to a mouse, dash, and silently and composedly looked at him while they were made ready, and while he besought her. Colon. The women passionately screeching at him all the time, and the men sternly calling out to have him killed with grass in his mouth. Period. Once he went aloft, and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking, semicolon. Twice he went aloft, and the rope broke, and they caught him shrieking, semicolon. Then the rope was merciful and held him. And his head was soon upon a pike, with grass enough in the mouth for all Saint Antoine to dance at the sight of. It's an extraordinary passage, and I can only point to a few things in it. First, Foulon, he was a government official who had said, let them eat grass if they are hungry. And so that's why we have all the grass being stuffed in him. And what you can see, I hope, visually is this balancing of a little bit longer claws down and up and head foremost on the steps of the building, two short ones, now on his knees, now on his feet, right? It's bouncing kind of back and forth. And then we drag and move him. We have his short, torn, bruised, panting, bleeding, and then entreating and beseeching. These longer words building out of bleed, entreat, beseech. But bleeding, two disyllabic, bleeding, trochaic, entreating, trisyllabic, beseeching. We have these prefixes on those words that add a little bit of like pathos to the moment. All of these semicolons add up until we culminate with the colon, and then the last clause of the men and women that are there before the period. In the midst of that, we have these dashes with the cat simile. And then we have a second sentence in the paragraph, once, twice, then. It's really cool. We're expecting thrice, but just like the rope successfully holds, Dickens changes that expected word. A few things on why is the rope merciful? In the first case, and largely these come from class discussion that I had with my students, the rope is merciful because if it doesn't work, these people might tear him limb from limb, draw and quarter him. And then there's the other approach is that it's ironic. He is going to die. So it's like being held aloft, being held by the Father in death, like the mercy that is there, hopefully for him in his forgiveness by God. And then lastly, just a comment that absolutely blew me away. The reason the rope breaks is he's fat. Like all these other people are starving, but he is a rich aristocrat. And so they haven't taken that into account. Here are just my notes from class, which I like to include. Tellson's as a site of communication, as a center of communication. So this continues just the other metaphors that I was identifying earlier. As was natural, the headquarters and great gathering place of Monseigneur in London was Tellson's Bank. Spirits are supposed to haunt the places where their bodies most resorted, and Monseigneur, without a guinea, haunted the spot where his guineas used to be. Moreover, it was the spot upon which such French intelligence as was most to be relied upon came quickest. Again, Tellson's was a munificent house and extended great liberality to old customers who had fallen from their high estate. Again, these nobles had seen the coming storm in time and anticipating the plunder or confiscation, had made provident remittances to Tellson's, who were always to be heard of there by their needy brethren. To which it must be added that every newcomer from France reported himself and his tidings at Tellson's, almost as a matter of course. So a long quote just to emphasize this other idea of a new center of communication and conduits of knowledge. This next passage from Drawn to the Lodestone Rock is Darnay, and it connects to the idea of not letting her have a space of being her own woman. As he walked to and fro with his resolution made, he considered that neither Lucie nor her father must know of it until he was gone. Lucie should be spared the pain of separation. And then later, it was a hard day, that day of being among them, with the first reservation of their joint lives at hand. It was a hard matter to preserve the innocent deceit of which they were profoundly unsuspicious. So innocent deceit, recalling kind deception from Pross and Laurie. Again, this novel is not giving Lucie the space to be strong, to make choice with knowledge. And so I just want to keep emphasizing this, that it's not Lucie's fault that Lucie is limited in what happens in this novel. All right, this brings us to the illustrations. First, the two by Phiz. Here's the accomplice. It's very kind of word for word. We have the saw, we have the candle, we have the suspicion, the fear of murder. Back here, it's kind of cool. We have a figure looking over the shoulder, almost as though they are being watched. On the top shelf, we have various medical instruments, but we also have a skull. The skull almost seems to also be watching them, part of this murdered dead body language. And then the shoe tools. Again, kind of cutting this down to size, it a little bit recalls what will happen, or anticipates what will happen with creating guillotines and transforming different parts, right? So with Foulon, right, they're going to hang him, as we see here. So this is Foulon in the middle. Here's the wave of all of these figures. Here's Vengeance banging her drum. This is Madame Defarge. You can tell by the hat. There's a dagger that she's wearing. This image actually kind of conflates Foulon and the governor. And then here is the lamppost where they're going to string him up. In the background, you can see the Bastille. So if you count, 1, 1, 2, 3, they probably extend backwards. So just giving us a visual sense of where things are. And that extreme energy with all the women's hair wafting one direction, but their bodies going the other, and tromping over some men who look kind of not very well dressed. So perhaps even their own men in the heat of the revolution. Then coming to McLennan's, John McLennan's Harper's illustrations. Here for an opinion, there's Darnay and Lucie. And then here is the hacking. So, sorry, this is a plea. Here's the hacking. There's Prost, the candle, and Laurie. He's got the hatchet, and then the table, kind of a significantly different table. Interestingly, we also have the wall barrier in the back, the screen. Here they are put next to each other. Again, this is now, it's become a constant that McLennan and Phiz are illustrating one of the same scenes. McLennan, because he just illustrates more, can't obviously do all of them. And a couple of things that are the same, the bench, the placement of Pross, the candle, but the seriousness of the McLennan is so striking. This the straight back of Pross versus the comic bend from Phiz, and the resolute nature here of Laurie versus this hesitant, kind of almost even shaky instance. Make out with like even the grip on the table, and the shape of the table being so significantly different. Right? It seems like we have a simple bench here, but this is carved out to make room, probably to facilitate the action of making shoes. So I'm going to talk first about the illustrations over here, which are echoing footsteps. So there's baby Lucie and Miss Pross. Interestingly playing maybe like with kind of a whip thing, a kite, I'm unsure, but held together by a string that Pross is holding. And then we have the revolutionaries in this really interesting triangular image getting ready to storm the Bastille. On Saturday, September 3rd, 1859, we have references to uprisings and enslavements. And of course, we're only a year away from the Civil War. And it's on the emancipation question again. The agitation by some Southern politicians of the revival of the slave trade and the undoubted fact that African Negroes are constantly landed in the Southern states and sold to the planters imparts new interest to the inquiry which is being made by practical men into the working of emancipation in the British West Indies. And so it's a reminder of empire and of enslavement and the background of that to which both of these, or to which the Tale of Two Cities is being serialized in Britain and in England. And if you compare All the Year Round is not talking about this material. So it's different reading experiences for different audiences. Then the sea still rises. This is the hanging of the governor. So here the crowd is there. Here's the lamp post with actually a lamp. And then there you can see more clearly the head. I didn't look at this passage, but this is the mender of roads. And this is the man that helps come to burn the chateau. You got to see the flames, the future flames rising out of his pipe. A fascinating advertisement here as we move towards the last installment. For several months and past, we have printed from 80 to 93,000 copies per week of Harper's Weekly, more than double that of any other illustrated newspaper in the country. And then they tell you how to get the back orders. So an incredibly popular serialization that people are gobbling up. And then in the illustrations, we have Darnay right there running to France. And then here is Darnay and Stryver, where he's trying to be like, hey, maybe this Evremond person is not as bad. And then to conclude, here is an ironic advertisement that appears where everybody's reading. It is immensely popular. Miss Paddington's new book, Knitting Work. 10,000 copies have been sold. So it's just very funny that with Madame Defarge knitting all the time, we advertise a knitting experience. All right. With that, it brings us to a conclusion, and we'll see you for the next installment as we start book 3 and the revolution continues.